Hello and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study Podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke and I am thy host. And today we're talking about Genesis chapter 23. So let's read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. And while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 23 has 20 verses. Let's read the chapter as we get started. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah, and Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abram went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me a property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. Now Ephron was sitting amongst the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites of all who went in at the gate of his city, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, But if you will, hear me. I give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver, what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. That is the text of Genesis chapter 23. Thank you everyone for joining us again for another Bible study. Today's study is probably going to be a little bit shorter than some of our previous ones. This chapter is pretty straightforward, and I'm not really sure how many additional comments I have to make other than just going over and summarizing the text. It's pretty matter of fact today. Let's remind ourselves of the context of the last couple chapters, and then we'll discuss what we just read in chapter 23. So in chapter 21, we finally see the fulfillment of God's promise to give Abraham and Sarah a son. We have Isaac being born. And then in our Bible study yesterday, chapter 22, we have God testing Abraham's faith, asking Abraham to go and to sacrifice Isaac in the land of Moriah. And Abraham passes this test of faith, but God keeps him from killing Isaac and sacrificing him. Instead, he provides a ram to be sacrificed. And this proves that Abraham is indeed a man of faith, and it displays the faith that God has been developing in him for 25 plus years now. Other than that one event, we don't know a whole lot, and we don't have a lot of information about the upbringing and early years of Isaac and these kind of middle years of Abraham and Sarah's life. As we open up chapter 23, what we see is the next really significant event in Abraham's life, and that is, unfortunately for him, the death of his wife Sarah, who has been with him on this great journey of faith. We are skipping several years in between chapter 21 and chapter 22, and now skipping even more years between 22 and 23. So we're covering this section of Abraham and Sarah's life rather quickly. That brings us to our information that we have on our PDF, which you can download on our website for free. Just search for Genesis 23 To Be Like Christ in Google, and you should be able to find it under our 5-minute study. You can click the download link there, and it should automatically download the PDF for you. If you'd like to go ahead and get all of the PDFs printed off for you in a nice bound book form, you can do that on Amazon. You can purchase the book. There's a link down in the description. Whether you're on YouTube or on the podcast platform, you should be able to find that link. So I'd encourage you to go out there there and get the PDF, we do have a new map today, which is on the PDF, which will help you understand where exactly these events play out. But I talked about these years passing between chapter 21 and 22 and now 23. So let's talk about our first category, first section on our PDF, which is always when. When did these events happen in history? Well, Abraham was born about 2,000 years before Jesus was born, about 1996 BC, and he lives for 175 years. So we're definitely now into the latter half of Abraham's life. Remember, Isaac was born when Abraham was 100, and Sarah was around the age of 90. Sarah dies in this chapter at the age of 127. So this is roughly 37 years after she receives the gift of her son Isaac from the Lord. About 37 years between chapter 21 and chapter 23. Before we get into our text, we want to make sure we know who our main characters are, and they're pretty familiar today, other than one guy who was introduced to us just in this chapter, a Hittite. But first, we have Abraham. Abraham was a man from Ur of the Chaldeans who God called to move to Canaan. God said that he was going to make Abraham's descendants into a great nation, and that they were going to receive the land of Canaan as their inheritance. So the great nation part of Abraham's promise starts with his son, Isaac, who was born in chapter 21. And from there, we're going to continue to follow Abraham's family until God makes them into a large nation of people. And that will happen in a relatively short period of time, chapter-wise. It's not going to take us that many chapters to make Isaac, who is now the only descendant of Abraham, into a large nation. Let's say about 25 chapters or so. And then we're going to be reading about this nation of people for really the rest of the Old Testament. We also have Sarah as our main character. She is the wife of Abraham and the mother of Isaac. And as we already mentioned, she is going to pass away in this chapter. And then we have Ephron. Ephron is a Hittite man who sells a cave to Abraham, a cave that Abraham wanted to bury Sarah in. Our map today is relatively simple. We are in a very narrow area of land. Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, which we're told is in Hebron. Hebron is about 15 miles to the west of the Dead Sea. Sarah's buried at the cave of Machpelah, which was east of Mamre, so just east of Hebron, according to verse 17. So Hebron, and then just east of Hebron is where the cave of Machpelah is located. So with that, we're already into our outline section for today. Let's break our 20 verses down and make sure we understand what we just read. And as I mentioned, I think it should be shorter today because it's pretty straightforward. Most of this text is just the conversation and kind of the negotiation between Abraham and Ephron as they negotiate over buying and selling this field. But let's start off with section number 1. And that's just the first 2 verses where we're told kind of the key detail of the chapter. This is the death of Sarah. So Sarah dies at 127 years old. She doesn't live nearly as long as Abraham. He's going to live to be about 175. And so he outlives her by roughly 40 years or so, because remember, she's 10 years roughly younger than he is. So he's going to be alive for quite a few more decades. At Sarah's death, Isaac would have been 37, I think we mentioned that, and Abraham would have been 137. And we're told that Abraham mourns for his wife, which is fitting and understanding, especially as she has been his companion on this great journey of his, this great relocation of his throughout his life. He's gone all the way from Ur of the Chaldees all the way up to Haran, then down to Canaan, then he's been down in Egypt, and now he's back in Canaan. It's been quite a life. A lot has happened here, and Sarah has been his constant and faithful companion through all of this. So it makes sense that he mourns. And we see here that it's not unmanly, or it's not something to be ashamed of for a man to mourn his wife, especially a wife as good as her. I do want to mention, and so in connection with Sarah's death, that the rest of the Bible speaks very highly of Sarah. There's verses like Isaiah 51 and 1 Peter chapter 3 that speak highly of her. And I think that that's important to point out, because sometimes we can read the stories of these biblical characters and we can think, wow, that person really isn't as good as I always thought that they were. And we read a lot about Sarah's faults in Genesis. We read about her relationship with Hagar and how that wasn't always the best, and how she tries to rush the plan of God by giving Hagar to Abraham. We learn about her laughing at God when God promises to give her a son in her old age. We read about her lying to Pharaoh and to Abimelech about being Abraham's wife. And sometimes those historical narratives can paint our perception of somebody, and we can start to think, oh, maybe Sarah's not as good as really I always thought she was, as sometimes she's presented. So I wanted to make it clear that the Bible does speak very highly of her, and I think God thinks highly of her. I think it's important to remember that if our whole life was written about and all of our mistakes were on display for the world to read about, we probably wouldn't appear like that good people either. If people knew about all of our mistakes and our shortcomings, they might paint their perception of us a little bit, right? And so I think it's important to understand the way that the Bible presents her moving forward as a godly woman. Yes, she wasn't perfect. She was as human as any of us, but overall, the way that God speaks about her in the rest of the scriptures is positive. And so I think that's the way that we should view her life overall. And there's a good lesson in that God doesn't view us as just a culmination of our mistakes. He looks at the bigger picture when he's assessing our character. And that's something that we're all going to appreciate when we have to give an answer for our lives. This brings us to section number 2, which is our final section today, verses 3 through 20. This is the bulk of the chapter. What we see is Abraham visits the Hittites, who are the people that live in that area of the land, and he asks to purchase a plot of land to bury Sarah. Abraham evidently had a very good reputation in this part of the world, and he was very respected by his neighbors and those who knew him. The Hittites told him that he could have any location that he desired. Any of their tombs he could have, the choicest of them or the best of them he could have, and no one was going to refuse him the very best place to bury his wife. The Hittites describe him as a prince of God. So probably like Abimelech, they recognized that God's blessing was on Abraham by the way that God made him flourish, and probably also through the son that was born to him in his old age. And they recognize that God's blessing is on this man. So they say, you can have any tomb, any cave, any sepulcher that you want. The land is yours. Take your pick. He asks a man, a specific Hittite named Ephron, if he'd be willing to sell him a field and a cave that was located on that field, and this is the cave of Machpelah or Machpelah. Ephron told him that he would just give it to him for free. Again, we see the respect that they have for him, but Abraham, he insists on paying a fair price. Abraham and Ephron end up agreeing on the price of 400 shekels of silver. And so since Abraham insists on paying this, it seems that Ephron just permits him to do it. It doesn't seem like it's a massive sum of money for these men who seem somewhat wealthy already. And so they do this as a formality, and they draw up the legal rights to this, and the land is exchanged, and it's now in Abraham's possession. And then Abraham takes Sarah, and he buries her at this cave of Machpelah. That brings us to the end of chapter 23, and I don't really think that I have a whole lot of other comments to add in here. This is just a chapter marking a very significant place in Abraham's life and in Isaac's life, the death of a wife and the death of a mother. And from here, we're going to move on into the elder years of Abraham as Abraham begins to think about his future posterity, and he begins thinking about finding a wife for his son Isaac. He doesn't want him to just marry any old woman from the land, any foreigner or any woman who worships, who knows what gods. He wants him to marry someone who's going to respect their family traditions and their God, their family God, the one who's made these promises to Abraham and to his posterity. So you got to look for a special woman, and we've actually already read about her. She was introduced to us very quickly in the last chapter. If you remember who we might be talking about, we're going to talk about her and Isaac in the next chapter, in chapter 24, Lord willing. Being that it's a Friday on the day that I'm recording this, I suppose it's good that we have a shorter study, a little bit easier study to close out the week. But before we close, let's talk about our application. And this kind of ties into what I had already said about the faithfulness of Sarah. We often talk in churches and Bible classes and Bible studies about the greatness of Abraham's faith. And certainly, Abraham had admirable faith. but rarely do we consider Sarah's faith. Sarah was willing to follow her husband and to move hundreds of miles away from her home and her family to obey God's instructions to Abraham to move to Canaan. She has to also be willing to go along with this plan, right? I suppose she could have left Abraham or fought him tooth and nail, but that's not what we see. It seems that she goes willingly with her husband because she also believes that God's promises are going to be fulfilled through them. We also see that she very patiently waits for her promised son until she's 90 years old. Now, she has her moments of doubt and her moments of trying to do things her own way and fulfill God's promises and according to her will rather than God's will, right? But at the end of the day, she does wait and she receives this promise from the Lord as a blessing to her and a blessing to Abraham. So we see that she's a woman who believed God. We see that she's a woman with faults, but don't we all have faults? Abraham certainly had his faults, and we talked about how Abraham and Sarah weren't chosen because they were just so righteous and so upright and more godly than anyone else in the world. This is really about what God is doing through them, sometimes in spite of their lack of faith and in spite of their errors and their deficiencies. Imperfect as she was, she still receives God's blessings and believed in God's promises. The Apostle Peter wrote that Christian women should consider themselves as daughters of Sarah if they, quote, do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So evidently, Sarah did a lot of good, and evidently she was a fearless woman. And these were some of the things that marked her character. You would have to be kind of fearless, right? To move hundreds of miles, especially in those ancient days. You couldn't just hop on a plane or a train and come back home whenever you wanted, or it wasn't easy to travel in those days. Not like there was lots of infrastructure. I mean, these are pretty early days after the flood, relatively early days. And so, I mean, the earth is still wild in a lot of ways. And yet Sarah is willing to go with her husband and make this tremendous journey. And that would have taken a lot of courage, and she's admirable for that. And so Peter talks about Christian women being daughters of Sarah if they share these characteristics, doing good and not fearing anything that's frightening. So she's a role model for modern women of all ages. So I think it's a good thing to do here in chapter 23 to take this chapter and to dedicate it to thinking about the godly woman that Sarah was and the example that she sets for all women going forward. So that is our study and our application for Genesis chapter 23. Thanks for studying along with me. Lord willing, on Monday, we will be back to discuss chapter 24, and on Tuesday, chapter 25, which will put us halfway through the book of Genesis. We've made a lot of progress. We've talked about a lot of things, and so if you need to, on our 2 days off on the weekend, go back and maybe refresh yourself on what we've talked about. That'll prep you, keep your foundation strong for building on that foundation as we go throughout the rest of the book. If you're listening on a podcast player that allows you to leave a review, if you leave us a 5-star review, that would be super appreciated. There's other ways, though, non-monetary ways that you can support our work. If you leave comments on the YouTube videos, or some podcast platforms allow comments to be left. If you feel there's any key information that you want to add to the study, or you want to ask a clarifying question, or you have some application that you've taken away from this that you want to share, please leave it in the comment section. Also hit the like button, and then sharing our resources on your social media, with your Bible study groups. All those are great non-monetary ways that you can support the podcast and help us to get, hopefully, good Bible study material out into the world so more people can know God better. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Lord willing, we'll be back talk about Genesis chapter 24 very soon.